A black governor, calm and composed, was driving home after a long day of serving his state. He was ready to reunite with his family. But the moment he was pulled over on a quiet stretch of highway, everything changed. A racist police officer, arrogant and unrelenting, targeted him without reason, refusing to believe a black man could drive a car like that. The officer humiliated him, accusing him of being a criminal, treating him with disdain in full view of passing cars. What happened just minutes later shocked everyone. The truth came out, and the officer learned a lesson he would never forget. The governor's quiet defiance set off a chain of events that no one saw coming, a moment that turned into a symbol of justice and accountability. Stay with me, this is a powerful story about power, prejudice, and standing tall against injustice that you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. The road stretched long and quiet under the tender embrace of twilight. The kind of quiet that, in America, can soothe you to sleep or lull you into forgetting. It was that in-between hour, just before the streetlights flicker on and just before the dark settles deep. Dorian Pierce's hands rested easy on the wheel of his black sedan. The kind of car that whispered dignity but announced power. He was returning from another town hall. Another room full of promises, frustrations, and questions that had no easy answers. As he drove, his tailored suit creased slightly with the sway of the car, a minor imperfection against a man who otherwise seemed flawless, unshakably composed. Like still water hiding a deep current, he hummed to himself, an old gospel tune from his youth, the kind his mother would sing when the weight of the world made her sit on the porch a little longer than usual. The highway was nearly empty. Clean, spacious, almost peaceful. But Dorian knew better. For men like him, peace was always provisional. It began with a flicker of red and blue in his rearview mirror. A trick of light, he thought. But no, the sirens soon followed, sharp and unrelenting, breaking through the quiet like a rock through glass. Dorian frowned, his brow furrowing just slightly, hardly an expression of surprise. More of recognition, he signaled, easing the car to the shoulder. The hum of the engine fading into stillness. Now what? He murmured softly to himself, his hands steady as he reached for his wallet. This wasn't unfamiliar ground. This was America, where the act of pulling over could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. Where a black man in a nice car was more than a man, he was a symbol. A question, a provocation, and even if he happened to be the governor of the state. Even then, the story began the same way. The officer approached slowly, deliberately. Dorian watched him in the side mirror. A white man with a buzzed head. His stride heavy with practiced authority. There was something in the officer's gait, a swagger. A weight that Dorian could read like scripture. The officer's hand hovered just above the butt of his holstered gun. 1,000 thoughts raced through Dorian's mind. And yet he breathed evenly. Rolled down the window. And said, "Good evening, officer." The man said nothing at first. Instead, he leaned down, his shadow spilling into the car. "Already, he owns the space. License and registration," the officer said, his voice sharp, devoid of the courtesy Dorian usually encountered in those town halls he drove back from. Dorian's movements were slow, deliberate. He kept his hands in full view. His words measured. "Of course, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" The man didn't answer. His eyes scanned Dorian, starting with his face and then drifting to the polished lapels of his suit. The clean-cut shirt, the silent insignia of privilege. Dorian recognized the look. It was a look older than this country, passed down like inheritance, a look that asked silently, "Who does this man think he is?" The officer finally spoke, his tone clipped. "What are you doing out here? Driving a car like this?" There it was. The words hung in the air, deceptively casual, as though they were only about the car, and not about the man sitting inside it. Dorian blinked once, slow and deliberate, giving the officer a moment to reconsider. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'm on my way home. I'd like to know why you pulled me over." The officer straightened slightly, as though challenged. His posture stiffened, and his face hardened in response. He doesn't like the question, Dorian thought. Men like this rarely did. "You fit a description," the officer said flatly, his gaze unyielding. "A description? A black man in a black car," the officer said, as though the words explained themselves. Dorian's fingers tightened just slightly around his wallet. He felt a quiet anger uncoil in his chest, not the sharp kind, but the kind that simmers. Familiar and enduring, born of repetition. How many times, how many versions of this same moment had he lived? He wanted to say it then. Do you know who I am? He wanted to throw his title and his power like a shield between himself and the officer's assumptions. But he didn't. Dorian Pierce knew that titles only mattered when people believed they belonged to you. And men like Whitman didn't believe. Instead, Dorian met the officer's gaze in the side mirror and asked quietly, "Am I being accused of something, officer?" Whitman's lip curled, as though he'd just been insulted. It's the tone, Dorian thought. Black men are always taught to watch their tone. Step out of the vehicle, the officer said. Dorian stared straight ahead for a moment, breathing deeply as the sun dipped lower, turning the highway into a path of shadows. He thought of the people he represented, the people who looked to him as a symbol of hope. He thought of his mother's voice singing gospel. He thought of every name he'd read in the headlines, every man who didn't have his title, his resources, his platform. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes. He stood tall, his figure cutting a long shadow in the fading light. He didn't speak, he didn't argue, he simply stood. And as the officer glared at him, his hand still too close to his gun, Dorian realized something with chilling clarity. This man doesn't see a governor. He doesn't even see a man. He sees a question that needs answering, a threat that needs containing. And suddenly, the road didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt dangerous. The air on the side of the road had grown heavy. The hum of passing cars was distant, like the faint murmur of a river that had no reason to stop. Dorian Pierce stood tall beside his black sedan, the weight of silence pressing on him like an invisible hand. Officer Whitman remained in front of him, feet planted wide, his thumb twitching near the holster of his gun. It wasn't just the stance of a man in charge. It was the stance of a man proving he was in charge. Dorian had seen this kind of man before in courthouses when he was a young lawyer, in boardrooms when he climbed the ranks, and now, here, on this quiet stretch of highway. Always the same damn man. Wearing different faces but carrying the same bone-deep belief that his authority required no question. That his suspicion was a verdict unto itself. Turn around. Hands on the car. Whitman barked. The edge in his voice had sharpened, as if Dorian's mere calm was an affront to him. For a second, Dorian didn't move. He let the words sit there in the air between them, exposed for what they were, less an order, and more a test. How far could this man go? Officer, I'm going to comply, Dorian said, his voice even, controlled. But I need to understand why? Have I broken a law? Whitman's face flared red, his authority stung by the question. Authority, after all, only works when it goes unquestioned. I don't owe you an explanation. Whitman snapped. Now, do what I said. Dorian turned slowly, placing his hands on the hood of his car. The metal was warm under his palms. He looked straight ahead at the highway, where a white minivan passed. The driver glanced briefly at him, a white man with thinning hair and a tired face, before looking away, his curiosity curbed by discomfort. The minivan kept going, faster this time, as if the driver didn't want to be caught witnessing something he wasn't supposed to see. It was an old dance. Dorian thought, one as American as the asphalt beneath his feet. A black man stopped, searched, humiliated, and the world around him learning to avert its gaze. Whitman patted him down with mechanical force, his hands moving brusquely across Dorian's back and shoulders. Where are you coming from? Whitman asked, his voice clipped. A meeting, Dorian replied, staring straight ahead. Where are you going? Home. Whitman snorted softly, as if the word was a lie, as if home were too simple, too dignified a destination for someone like him. Got anything illegal in that car? No. Whitman moved to the side, leaning close enough that Dorian could feel his breath, a deliberate invasion of space. You sure about that? Dorian turned his head just slightly, meeting Whitman's narrowed gaze. I'm sure. The moment stretched taut between them, and Whitman didn't look away. To him, this wasn't just about suspicion, it was about something deeper, something uglier. Dorian understood it all too well. Whitman wasn't looking for contraband or criminality. He was looking for something wrong, something that would prove his own assumptions true. Because if Dorian were guilty of anything at all, Whitman would be vindicated. And a black man in a suit. In a luxury car. With a voice full of calm, he'd have to be guilty of something. Whitman stepped back, his eyes still burning. "Pop the trunk," he ordered. This time, Dorian turned fully around. His voice was measured, but his eyes betrayed the fire that simmered just beneath. "Do you have probable cause, officer?" Whitman's lip curled. He pointed a stiff finger at Dorian, as though the gesture itself was enough to justify everything. "You're gonna tell me how to do my job now?" "No," Dorian said, "but I know the law. And that's not how it works." Whitman took a step forward, so close now that Dorian could see the thin film of sweat on his brow. "Listen here, boy." There it was. That word. That old word. It slithered into the space between them. Ancient and poisonous, carrying with it the weight of every man who'd ever used it to shrink another. Dorian straightened his shoulders, his calm an act of defiance. "I think we're done here," Dorian said quietly, his voice like iron wrapped in silk. But Whitman wasn't done. Men like Whitman are never done until they've won. "You think you're better than me?" Whitman sneered, his anger now spilling out. "Unchecked. Driving around like you own the place? Wearing that suit. Flashing that car like you got something special. I see your kind all the time. Thinking you're untouchable." Dorian stared at him. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply stood there, letting Whitman's words expose themselves for what they were. "Do you see me now?" Dorian finally asked, his voice low. "Or do you just see what you want to see?" Whitman froze. For the first time, the question caught him off guard, as though someone had torn down a curtain he'd been hiding behind. But before he could respond, the sound of another car approached slower this time. Dorian turned his head slightly, watching as the driver pulled up and stopped a few feet ahead. A woman stepped out, phone in hand. She was white, middle-aged, with a look on her face that suggested both hesitation and resolve. "Is everything okay here?" she called out. Her phone raised just slightly. Whitman's shoulders stiffened. His hand dropped from his holster. But his expression remained sour, like a man whose game had been interrupted. He turned sharply to Dorian. "You're lucky," he muttered under his breath. Dorian said nothing. He didn't need to. He just stood there tall, unshaken, and seen. The woman stayed where she was, her phone still recording. Whitman shot her a dark glare before walking back toward his cruiser. The sound of his boots on the gravel was sharp, a retreat more bitter than he could bear. Dorian stayed by his car, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He could feel his heart pounding, but his face betrayed nothing. It was a skill he'd honed for decades, a skill every black man learns. Sooner or later, the woman approached cautiously, lowering her phone. "Are you okay?" Dorian turned to her, a small but weary smile on his face. "I'm fine," he said. "Thank you." She nodded, looking back at the retreating cruiser. He had no right to do that. Dorian met her gaze, searching her face for a moment. He appreciated her presence, but he also understood what her presence meant, that her recording, her voice, had held more weight than his. That truth, no matter how quietly spoken, was sometimes only heard when repeated by someone else. "Drive safe," she said, before heading back to her car. Dorian watched her leave. He looked out at the empty road. The quiet returned now, but it wasn't the same quiet. It was a quiet full of echoes, the echoes of Whitman's voice, of a word that still lingered, of a question left unanswered. "Who do you think you are?" Dorian climbed back into his car, his hands steady on the wheel. He took a breath and started the engine, the low hum filling the silence. The road stretched on, endless and shadowed, and somewhere, deep in his chest, he could feel the weight of the next moment, the next day, the next battle waiting for him just around the bend. The black sedan purred softly as Dorian Pierce guided it back onto the highway, the taillights of the woman's car now fading into the growing darkness. The evening was settling thick and low across the land, as though the earth itself were trying to hide the ugliness that sometimes erupted on its surface. He drove in silence, his hands steady, his face impassive, but his mind churned. Moments like these never ended when the officer walked away. "No, they followed you, like a shadow stitched into your skin. They lived in the tightness of your shoulders, in the quiet sigh you let slip when you're finally alone. They sat next to you in the passenger seat and whispered, 'How long until the next time?'" Dorian knew, and had always known, that to exist as a black man in America was to live under an unspoken contract. That contract had rules you had not written. But you understood. Rule 1. Be calm. Rule 2. Be compliant. Rule 3. Be smaller. The contract was as old as the country itself. And tonight, Dorian had refused it. He had been calm, but not meek. He had complied, but not surrendered. He had not made himself small. And for men like Officer Whitman, that was unacceptable. Dorian shook his head slightly, a bitter smile curling at the edge of his mouth. He thought of his father, a man who had been quieter than Dorian but no less proud. He remembered his father's warnings, given long ago. It don't matter how high you climb, son. There are folks who'll only see where you started, and they'll hate you more for leaving it behind. The memory hovered in his mind as the sedan ate up the road, the night growing darker with every mile. Dorian turned onto a smaller stretch of highway, trees rising tall and black on either side of him like silent witnesses. He had almost settled back into the rhythm of the drive when the headlights appeared behind him. Two bright, predatory eyes in the rearview mirror. His jaw tightened. He watched the car approach fast and aggressive. Dorian shifted slightly in his seat, his pulse quickening despite himself. A part of him hoped it was just another driver in a hurry. But deep down, he already knew. The car, a beat-up pickup truck with a rumbling engine, swerved too close to his rear bumper. Dorian gripped the wheel, steadying the sedan with practiced calm. The truck lingered there, almost taunting, before whipping around to his left and pulling up alongside him. The driver was a white man, his face shadowed but unmistakably hostile. Two other figures sat in the truck, barely visible through the glare of their headlights. The man in the driver's seat leaned forward, just enough for Dorian to see the sneer on his lips. "Where you headed, Governor?" the man yelled, his voice muffled but still audible through the closed windows. The word, "Governor," dripped with something foul, like oil slicking over clean water. Dorian didn't look at him. He kept his gaze straight ahead, his face a mask of quiet defiance. "Look at that suit, boys," the man shouted again, this time loud enough to cut through the noise of both engines. "Must be nice. Must be real nice." The truck veered closer, edging into Dorian's lane, forcing him to tap his brakes. A flare of anger ignited in his chest. But Dorian extinguished it quickly. This wasn't the moment to lose control. Be calm. Be compliant. Be smaller. But this time, Dorian couldn't bring himself to be smaller. He glanced over, just briefly, meeting the man's eyes through the truck window. It was only a second, but it was enough. The driver's face twisted, as if the act of being really seen was an insult. "Stay in your lane, boy," the man spat, gunning the engine and pulling ahead. Dorian exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel loosening as the truck roared into the distance, its taillights shrinking to pinpricks. But the words lingered, sharp and stinging, in the quiet that followed. "Stay in your lane." Dorian had heard those words before. He had heard them as a boy in school, when a teacher told him that law school might be too ambitious. He had heard them as a young lawyer, when older white colleagues called him impressive for a man like you. He had heard them whispered behind closed doors, spoken out loud in parking lots, and thrown at him like bricks when he first ran for office. Those words were never about lanes. They were about limits, and they were meant to remind him that, no matter how far he'd come, some people still believed there was a line he wasn't allowed to cross. But as Dorian drove deeper into the night, he realized something else. Those words weren't just about him. They were about them, about men like Officer Whitman, about men in pickup trucks shouting through open windows, about the world that had given them the unspoken permission to behave this way. Dorian had crossed their line simply by existing, simply by refusing to bow, simply by driving his car down an empty road in the twilight. He smiled faintly to himself, though there was no humor in it. "What lane would that be?" he murmured, his voice a quiet challenge to no one but himself. The trees along the road blurred together into one long stretch of blackness. Somewhere far ahead, the lights of the city were waiting. Home was waiting, but Dorian knew that when he arrived, this night would follow him inside. It would sit at the dinner table. It would linger in the corners of his mind, and it would whisper the same question it always did. How long until the next time? The road ahead had thinned to a narrow thread, as though the world itself were pulling away. The trees loomed taller now, their shadows deeper, swallowing the edges of the highway until it felt as if Dorian Pierce were driving through a tunnel of night. His headlights cast a cold, white beam, one that felt fragile against the sheer darkness. There was a rhythm to the silence, but Dorian could feel something breaking underneath it, like a crack forming in a dam. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat. A brief, bright intrusion. Dorian glanced over. It was his assistant, Calvin, likely checking in. He thought about answering, about hearing a familiar voice to remind him of steadier ground, but he didn't. He couldn't. Tonight had become something else. And he knew, deep down, that this story wasn't finished yet. It began, again, with lights. Not red and blue this time, but a faint amber glow that came into view as Dorian approached a small gas station. It sat alone on the side of the road. The kind of place where the windows were scratched, the pump hoses cracked, and the lone fluorescent bulb above the shop flickered like a stuttering heartbeat. Dorian checked his fuel gauge. He didn't need gas, but instinct told him to stop. It wasn't a desire for coffee or a break, it was something more primal. He wanted to be where people were, even if just for a moment. Being alone in the dark had begun to feel like carrying too much silence. He pulled up slowly to the pump, the sedan gliding in as quietly as the man inside it. The station was mostly empty, save for an old pickup truck on the far side and a neon open sign that blinked unevenly in the shop window. A bell above the door chimed faintly as Dorian stepped inside. The cashier looked up from behind the counter. A white man, late 60s, with skin like wrinkled leather and eyes that had spent a lifetime watching the world harden. His gaze fixed on Dorian as he entered, one long, unblinking glance that said everything and nothing at all. "Evening," Dorian said politely, his voice low but steady. The cashier said nothing. Dorian felt the man's gaze linger on him as he made his way to the back of the store. He didn't need anything, really, maybe a bottle of water. He scanned the shelves, listening to the quiet creak of the floorboards beneath his shoes. Then he heard the faint sound of voices. At first, he thought it was a radio. But no, it was closer than that. Outside, Dorian turned his head slightly, glancing through the grimy window. Two men were standing near his car. One was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. The other was crouched slightly, peering through the passenger side window as if inspecting what he might find inside. Dorian's chest tightened. He stood for a moment, still and quiet, his bottle of water forgotten in his hand. He weighed his next steps carefully. Confrontation or patience? Pride or restraint? These were the choices black men made in moments like this. And they were never small. The cashier coughed from the counter, breaking the silence. Dorian turned to him, meeting his gaze head on. "You got friends out there?" Dorian asked evenly. The cashier's lips curled slightly into something that was not quite a smile. "They're just passing time. Ain't gonna bother you unless you give him a reason." There it was, the unspoken truth, laid bare. "It's your move, Governor." Dorian took a breath, set the bottle down on the nearest shelf, and walked toward the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped outside, the night air cool against his face. The two men didn't flinch or move. They kept their positions like statues. "Evening, gentlemen," Dorian said, his voice clear but not sharp. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his every movement deliberate. The man leaning against the hood turned his head lazily, exhaling a long plume of smoke. He was a wiry man with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, but his mouth was curled into the faint sneer of a man who didn't care to hide what he thought of you. "Nice car," he said, dragging out the words like they were meant to mean more. "Real nice." Dorian nodded. "Thank you." The other man, still crouched near the passenger side, stood up slowly. He was broader, heavier, with a shaved head and a look that seemed to beg for trouble. He glanced toward Dorian and then toward the sedan, as though weighing which was worth more of his time. "You headed somewhere important?" he asked. Dorian let the question hang for a moment, as though he had to think about it. "Home," he replied. The broad man chuckled, a sound low and humorless. "Ain't from around here, are you?" Dorian didn't answer that. The wiry man pushed himself off the car, tossing his cigarette to the gravel and grinding it under his boot. "A suit like that," he said, motioning toward Dorian, "makes me think you don't belong out here at all." Dorian's gaze didn't waver. He looked at the two men, at the pickup truck parked just a few yards away, and at the flickering light above the gas station. He knew what was happening here. This wasn't about the car. It wasn't even about the suit. This was about the audacity of his presence. "Here's the thing about belonging," Dorian said quietly, his voice steady as iron. "It's not something you decide for me." The air seemed to still. The two men exchanged a look, as though trying to decide whether those words were worth something more. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the broad man smiled. "Well, hell," he said, stepping back toward the truck. "We were just being friendly." The wiry man followed, though his eyes lingered on Dorian for a beat longer. "You have yourself a good night now," he said, his tone mocking. Dorian watched as they climbed into the truck and gunned the engine. The sound was deafening as they pulled away, their taillights shrinking into the dark. He exhaled a long, slow breath, and turned back to his car. The cashier was still watching him through the window, his face unreadable. Dorian slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and locked it. The car felt like a sanctuary now, its quiet hum wrapping around him like armor. As he pulled back onto the road, the station's light disappeared behind him. Swallowed by the night, he thought again of his father, and the way his voice could harden like stone when the truth demanded it. "The color of your skin," his father had once said, "isn't a crime, but the world will act like it is. And every time they test you, son, you'll have to decide how much of yourself you're willing to give up just to get through it." Dorian gripped the wheel tighter as the road opened up ahead. His father had been right about the world. But tonight, Dorian had given up nothing. And yet, the weight of it sat heavy on him, as though the night itself were pressing against his chest. He had miles to go before he'd see the lights of home. And he knew that out here, in the quiet, the fight was never really over. It just waited for the next stop, the next phase, the next test. The highway stretched on, long and unforgiving, as Dorian Pierce drove deeper into the night. The world outside was a smear of shadows and faint lights, farmhouses, gas stations, and distant towns that all seemed to blink past like fleeting memories. Inside the car, it was quiet, but not peaceful. The silence here wasn't a bomb. It was the silence of a courtroom after a verdict, of a house after an argument, of a man alone with thoughts he couldn't outrun. It was a familiar quiet. Dorian reached for the radio, desperate to break it, and the voice of a news anchor filled the space. Mid-sentence, Governor Pierce speaking earlier today at a town hall meeting in Wilkerson County, where he addressed ongoing concerns about state policies and racial disparities. His name sounded strange coming through the speakers. It wasn't really his name, not in this moment. On this road, where titles carried no weight, he turned the dial, switching to music, jazz, Miles Davis, his trumpet wailing softly, as though he, too, understood. The car ate up more miles, and Dorian let the music wash over him. But his grip on the wheel remained firm, his eyes sharp, fixed on the road ahead. Because even now, even here, he knew the world had not forgotten him. It had only grown quieter, waiting for its next move. And it came soon enough. The truck appeared again. At first, it was only a pair of lights in his rearview mirror, faint and distant, but as Dorian watched, they grew larger, closer, and more deliberate. The same truck, the same men. Dorian's jaw tightened. He could feel it rising in his chest again, that slow, familiar churn of anger and exhaustion. This is not a coincidence, he thought. The truck pulled up behind him, too close. Its headlights flooded the interior of Dorian's car, blinding him in the mirror. Then the truck swerved sharply to the left, pulling up alongside him again. There were two of them in the cab, now only two. Dorian recognized the driver, the broader man with the shaved head. His grin twisted into something cruel and mean. The wiry man leaned halfway out the passenger window, his voice carrying over the sound of engines. "Still out here, huh? Thought you'd be smart enough to turn around." Dorian didn't look at them. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of calm, though he could feel the heat in his chest threatening to spill over. The truck veered toward his car, close enough to force him onto the shoulder. Dorian braked just slightly, staying in control, refusing to let the car spin or skid. They were laughing now. He could hear it high and shrill. The kind of laughter that didn't mean joy but power. "They want me to react," Dorian thought. "They want me to give them what they're looking for." "Where's that fancy suit gonna take you now?" the wiry man shouted. "Nowhere but a ditch." The truck swerved again, a sharper move this time. Dorian had to brake hard. his car jolting as its tires scraped against the gravel. He caught his breath, steadying himself. The truck shot forward, speeding down the road and disappearing around a bend, its taillights flickering like twin embers. Dorian's heart pounded against his ribs, but he kept his breathing slow. He pulled the car back onto the road, the tires finding solid ground again. He pressed down on the accelerator, determined to keep moving, but as he turned the corner, he saw it. The truck parked sideways across the road, blocking both lanes. Dorian's hands froze on the wheel, the headlights of his car painting the scene ahead in harsh light. The two men stood outside the truck now, waiting. The broad man had his arms crossed, his chest puffed out like a rooster spoiling for a fight. The wiry man stood a little behind him, his face caught somewhere between excitement and nervousness, like a man who hadn't fully committed to what he was about to do. Dorian brought the car to a stop, his engine idling. The road was empty behind him, no one coming, no one to see. He could feel the weight of the night pressing in on all sides. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the hum of the car and the distant rustle of wind in the trees. Then the broad man took a step forward. "What's the matter?" he called out, spreading his arms wide. "Don't want to say hello?" Dorian didn't answer. He sat there, staring at the two men in his headlights. He felt a sudden clarity, sharp and undeniable. This was not a game. The broad man stepped closer, the light from the car cutting his figure into stark relief. "You think you're better than us, huh?" he shouted. "Driving through here in your fancy car, wearing that mask like you own the damn world." The word caught Dorian. Mask. That's what this is, he thought. That's what it's always been. In their eyes, his calm was not strength, it was a disguise. His car, his suit, his measured words, they were all masks he wore to hide who they thought he truly was. And they resented him for it. "How dare you hide yourself from us? How dare you pretend to be more than we say you are?" Dorian took a slow breath. He reached down and turned off the ignition. The engine fell silent, and the headlights dimmed. The world plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon. The broad man stopped, hesitating. He hadn't expected that. For a moment, the silence pressed back against him, like a force he didn't know how to fight. Dorian opened the car door and stepped out. He moved slowly, deliberately, his figure outlined against the night. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You've done enough," Dorian said quietly, his words cutting through the dark like a blade. "It's time for you to move." The broad man blinked, as though thrown off balance by the calm. "Or what?" he sneered, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Dorian stared at him, unmoving. "You're not as brave as you think you are," he said, "because if you were, you wouldn't need the dark. You wouldn't need the truck. You wouldn't need the two of you against one of me." The wiry man shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the truck. The broad man opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. And Dorian saw it then. The power was his now. Not because of his suit or his title, but because he had stripped them bare. "This is your last chance," Dorian said softly. "Move your truck." The two men stood there, their figures reduced to shadows. No longer giants but small, frightened things. Finally, the wiry man grabbed the broad man's arm. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's go." The broad man hesitated a moment longer, then turned sharply, muttering curses under his breath as he climbed into the truck. The engine roared back to life, and slowly, begrudgingly, they reversed, clearing the way. Dorian stood still, watching as the truck's taillights faded into the distance. When the road was quiet again, he climbed back into his car and started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the empty path ahead. As he drove on, Dorian felt the weight of the mask, the one they thought he wore. The one he knew he didn't fall heavy on his shoulders again. Because out here, on these roads, it wasn't enough to be strong. It wasn't enough to be calm. You had to be ready. And still, the road stretched on. The road was clear again. But it no longer felt like a road. It felt like a threshold, one that Dorian Pierce had crossed 1,000 times in his life, but that always demanded something new of him. This time, it had demanded his calm, his patience, and his dignity. He had given it all, and yet he could feel the weight of it in his bones, pressing down with every mile he put behind him. He drove slowly now, the sedan gliding through the night like a shadow. There were no lights ahead, no houses, no gas stations, just the endless stretch of dark pavement. framed by woods that seemed to lean inward, as though whispering secrets to one another. Dorian turned the radio back on. A talk show crackling through the speakers. A panel of voices argued politics, economics, race, each speaker wielding their perspective like a weapon. He listened for a moment, shaking his head faintly. Everyone had an answer, he thought, and yet the questions remained. The panel faded into static as the signal weakened. Dorian reached to switch it off. But before he could, the red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror again. His hand froze mid-air. A cold silence settled in the car. Heavier than the first time. Heavier than the second. Dorian's heart, steady just moments before, quickened in his chest. Here we go again, he signaled, pulled onto the shoulder, and stopped. He turned off the engine and rested his hands on the steering wheel. His movements measured, rehearsed. It was an old performance. And by now, he knew every step. Outside, gravel crunched under boots. Dorian caught a glimpse of the approaching figure, another officer. Tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette framed by the pulsing glow of his cruiser. This one moved differently than Officer Whitman. There was no swagger to him. Only purpose. The officer knocked on the window. Dorian rolled it down. License and registration, the officer said, his voice flat, professional. Dorian handed them over without a word. The officer took the documents, holding them just long enough to verify the name before glancing back at Dorian. His expression shifted slightly, his brow furrowing. You're the governor. It wasn't a question, it was a realization, spoken with something like surprise and suspicion tangled together. Dorian nodded. I am. The officer stepped back slightly, his hand moving away from the belt. He glanced over his shoulder at his cruiser, as though searching for what to do next. Finally, he turned back. I stopped you because your brake light is out, the officer said. Dorian's lips pressed into a thin line. My brake light is fine, he replied evenly. The officer paused, his eyes narrowing. Are you questioning me? Dorian looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the same thing he had seen 100 times before. Not malice. Not hatred, but the need to win. It was a need born of authority that resented being questioned. Especially by a black man who refused to shrink. No, Dorian said finally. I'm asking you if this stop is about something else. The officer's jaw tightened, as though Dorian's calm had struck him like a slap. The silence between them thickened, stretching out in the pale glow of the cruiser's lights. You can go, the officer said suddenly. His voice clipped, as though the words cost him something. He handed back the documents and stepped away. Dorian rolled up the window, restarted the engine, and pulled back onto the road. He should have felt relief. But he didn't. He felt tired. The farther he drove, the angrier he became, not the sharp anger of youth but the deep, lingering anger of a man who has seen too much and swallowed too much. This stop, this officer, this moment, it wasn't about him being a governor, a man of power, or a public servant. It was about him being a black man behind the wheel of a nice car. And nothing, it seemed, would ever change that. He thought of his father again, of his voice softened by age but hardened by experience. It doesn't matter how much you achieve. There will always be someone to remind you where they think you belong. Dorian gripped the wheel tighter. The city lights appeared at last. A distant glow on the horizon. Civilization, with all its promise and pitfalls. He could almost hear the hum of the streets, the traffic, the sirens, the voices. But as he reached the edge of town, something else caught his eye. A small crowd had gathered in front of a diner, white faces. Older faces staring at something on the sidewalk. A car was parked at an odd angle, its hazard lights flashing. Dorian hesitated for only a moment before he pulled over and stepped out of the car. It didn't take long to see what had drawn their attention. An older black man sat on the curb, his back hunched, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. Standing over him was a younger officer, another white man, his posture rigid, his words sharp and clipped. What are you doing out here? Huh? You causing trouble? The officer barked. The man didn't look up. I'm just trying to get home, he murmured. The crowd watched silently, their faces blank with that same mix of curiosity and discomfort Dorian had seen a dozen times before. And for the first time that night, Dorian felt his anger break through the surface. He stepped forward, his voice clear and steady. Officer, he said. The young officer turned sharply, startled. This doesn't concern you, Sir, it does now, Dorian said, closing the distance between them. He looked at the man on the curb. His face weathered, his shoulders small. He looked back at the officer. Why are you questioning him? The officer straightened, his authority bristling. He was loitering. Someone called it in. Loitering? Dorian repeated. Or existing? The officer's mouth opened to respond. But Dorian raised a hand, cutting him off. This man doesn't need to explain himself to you. He doesn't need to justify being here. Neither do I, neither does anyone. The crowd was silent. The older man looked up at Dorian, his eyes wide with something like disbelief. Dorian turned to him, offering a hand. Let's get you home, he said softly. The man hesitated before taking it, and as he stood, his shoulders seemed to regain some of their strength. The young officer said nothing. He watched as Dorian led the man away, his authority crumbling under the weight of something larger than the badge. As they reached Dorian's car, the older man spoke, his voice low. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Dorian said, opening the door for him. I did. As Dorian slid into the driver's seat once more, he looked back at the scene, the crowd, the officer, the diner bathed in neon light. He thought of all the masks people wore, officers, strangers, crowds, and how often those masks were used to hide not who they were, but who they were afraid of becoming. The engine hummed to life, and Dorian drove on, the weight of the night settling behind him. He had won a small moment of dignity. But the battle was far from over. It never was. The city unfolded before Dorian Pierce like an open wound, its streets a tangle of movement and light. Traffic signals flashed red and green, headlights pierced the dark, and neon signs flickered promises of late-night comfort. The familiar hum of the city would have once felt like relief. But tonight, it felt indifferent, another backdrop for a battle no one else seemed to see. Beside him in the passenger seat, the older man sat quietly, his shoulders still hunched, his hands clasped together as if trying to hold on to something fragile. Dorian hadn't asked his name yet. He had been too busy thinking about that young officer, about the sharpness of his voice, about the crowd that had stood there watching, saying nothing. Where do you live? Dorian asked finally, his voice softer than he expected. The man cleared his throat, his voice low and gravelly. Just off Holloway Avenue. Not far. Dorian nodded and turned down a quieter street. The city seemed calmer here. The buildings older, the lights dimmer. He glanced over at the man, taking in the details of his face, deep lines etched into his skin. The kind that came from years of looking over one's shoulder. There was weariness there, but there was also pride. As if the man's silence was less about submission and more about survival. I didn't need you to do all that back there, the man said, breaking the silence. I'm used to it. Dorian's jaw tightened. You shouldn't have to be. The man turned his head, studying Dorian for a moment. You think you're gonna change something? Dorian didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road. I think I have to try. The man chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. Well, you've got more fight in you than I do. That's for sure. They rode in silence for another moment before the man spoke again. You know what they said to me? Before you showed up? Dorian looked over briefly, his brow furrowed. What? They said, what are you doing out here at this hour? Shouldn't you be home? The man's voice held a mocking lilt, imitating the officer's words. Imagine that. A grown man being asked where he's supposed to belong. Dorian exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. You didn't owe them an answer. Didn't matter. The man shrugged. It never matters. Dorian dropped the man off at a small apartment building, its facade cracked and its windows dark. Before he climbed out of the car, the man turned to Dorian. You're the governor, aren't you? Yes, Dorian replied simply. The man nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Well, I guess that means someone's listening to you. Maybe it'll make a difference. Dorian didn't know what to say to that. He watched the man disappear into the building, his figure swallowed by shadows. And for a moment, the silence in the car felt impossibly loud. The drive home was short now, the city thinning out as he entered his own neighborhood, a place of manicured lawns and quiet streets, where the houses sat behind trimmed hedges like well-kept secrets. Here, the world seemed to exhale, as though the night itself dared not trouble its residents. But Dorian knew better. He pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting still for a moment as the night settled around him. The house was dark except for a single light glowing in the window, his wife's light. A small beacon of welcome. He smiled faintly, feeling some of the weight on his chest lift. But as he stepped out of the car, a voice shattered the stillness. "Excuse me, sir." Dorian turned sharply, his heart jolting before his mind could catch up. Across the street, a white woman stood on her porch, her figure framed by the harsh glow of her floodlight. She was older, mid-60s, maybe with a robe pulled tightly around her and a phone clutched in her hand. She squinted at Dorian through the darkness, her voice sharp and accusing. "What are you doing here?" Dorian's body tensed. He opened his mouth to respond, but she spoke again before he could. "We've had some break-ins around here lately. You know." For a moment, Dorian said nothing. He simply stood there, staring at her, his expression caught between disbelief and resignation. "This is my house," he said finally, his voice even but firm. "I live here." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting to the car, then back to him. "Oh." She lingered for a moment, as though she wasn't quite ready to believe him. "Well, I just wanted to be sure." "Now you are," Dorian replied. The woman muttered something under her breath and disappeared back into her house, the floodlight snapping off behind her. Dorian stood still in the dark for a long moment, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked up at the sky, as if searching for something, an answer. Maybe, or a question worth asking. Inside, the house was quiet, warm, and untouched by the world outside. His wife, Elena, was waiting in the living room, her expression softening when she saw him. "You're late," she said gently. "Long drive," Dorian replied, his voice weary. Elena frowned, crossing the room to him. "What happened?" Dorian hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It's nothing," he said finally. "Just one of those nights." She reached for his hand, her touch light but steady. "It's never nothing." He looked up at her then, his eyes dark with everything he hadn't said. "No," he murmured. "It never is." She nodded, understanding. She always understood. "Come sit," she said softly, guiding him toward the couch. Dorian sank into the cushions, his body heavy, his mind still racing. Elena sat beside him, their hands still entwined, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to breathe. But even here, even in the safety of his own home, he could still hear that woman's voice in his head, sharp and unrelenting. "What are you doing here?" He closed his eyes. Home. That was the answer. And still, the question lingered. The sun rose without asking for permission. It always did, sweeping its light across the city like a hand wiping clean a surface that could never truly be cleansed. The night before had already begun to feel like a bruise, a deep, invisible ache that throbbed beneath the skin of the day. Dorian Pierce stood at the window of his study, staring out at the street. The houses were lined up neatly under the pale blue sky, their curtains drawn, their gardens clipped and silent. From here, the world looked quiet, orderly, as though nothing at all had happened. But Dorian knew better. He thought about the older man on the curb, shoulders slumped under the weight of a question he should never have been asked. He thought about the woman across the street, wrapped in her robe, clutching her phone as if she had been defending her kingdom. And he thought about Officer Whitman, about those two men in the truck, and about every person who had stood by and said nothing. There was something unbearable about the way silence could linger after a storm. How the world seemed to go on, indifferent to the truth of what had happened. How everything could look the same, but nothing felt the same. Elena appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. She watched him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to interrupt his thoughts, before stepping forward. "Here," she said softly, placing the cup on the desk. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" Dorian shook his head. "I didn't." She sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Waiting, Dorian turned from the window and looked at her patience. Her strength, he wondered, not for the first time. How she managed to carry his burdens with him without ever making them her own. "I can't stop thinking about it," Dorian said finally, his voice low. "About what?" "About all of it," he replied. "About last night, and every night like it. About the way people looked at me like I didn't belong. Like I wasn't supposed to exist in their world. Even here, in my own neighborhood." His voice trailed off. Elena nodded. "And what are you going to do?" Dorian stared at her, as though the question itself carried too much weight. "What can I do?" he asked bitterly. "What's left to say? What's left to prove?" She leaned forward, her eyes sharp, unyielding. "Everything." The word landed between them, hard as stone. 2 hours later, Dorian stood in front of a podium at a hastily arranged press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones angled upward like hungry mouths, and reporters shouted questions before he'd even spoken a word. The morning papers had already latched onto pieces of the story: a disturbance involving the governor, an officer, and unnamed individuals on a rural road. The speculation had begun, but Dorian knew better than to let others control the narrative. He adjusted the microphone, the room quieting in response. When he spoke, his voice was calm but unmistakably charged like thunder held just behind the clouds. "Good morning," he began. "I want to speak plainly about something that happened to me last night." The silence deepened. I was stopped. Again, not because I broke the law, not because I posed a threat, but because someone looked at me, a black man behind the wheel of a nice car, and decided that I didn't belong. A murmur swept through the room. But Dorian didn't falter. Over and over, we hear the same questions. Why does this happen? How can we change? But those questions are not mine to answer. They are yours. Because the problem is not new. The patterns are not new. The silence, the suspicion, the hostility, all of it has been here, woven into the fabric of our lives. He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze scanning the room. A black man in America can rise to become a governor, a doctor, a judge, or a president, and yet, that man can still be stopped on the side of a road. He can still be questioned in his own neighborhood. He can still be asked to explain his presence, his very existence, as though it requires permission. The cameras clicked furiously, but the room itself remained still, as if frozen under the weight of his words. "I am tired," Dorian said, his voice softening, "but I am not broken. And I will not accept the silence that allows this to continue. Not for me, not for my family, and not for the man I met last night, who told me he was used to it. That is what we must fight, this idea that injustice is something to be accepted. That it is normal." His voice rose slightly, clear and resonant. "This is not normal. It is not acceptable. And it is not inevitable." The press conference played on television screens across the city, across the state, in homes and diners and offices. People watched, some in quiet recognition, some in anger, some with the uneasy feeling that they, too, had been part of the silence Dorian spoke of. Across the street from Dorian's house, the woman who had questioned him sat in her living room, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the television. The echo of his words stayed with her, settling in the back of her mind like an unanswered question. In the diner where the older man had been stopped, the waitress paused as she refilled a cup of coffee, her eyes lingering on the screen. Used to it, she thought, shaking her head. And in homes across the state, older men and women sat quietly, remembering their own roads, their own nights, their own moments when they had felt the weight of being seen but not known. Late that evening, Dorian sat on the porch, watching the sun slip below the horizon. Elena sat beside him, her presence steady and warm. "You said what needed to be said," she murmured. Dorian nodded. "It won't be enough." "No," she replied, "but it's a start." The street was quiet, the houses bathed in twilight. For a moment, Dorian allowed himself to believe that this stillness could hold. That maybe, one day, a man like him could drive home without being stopped. That maybe, one day, no one would need to ask, "What are you doing here?" The wind stirred gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint hum of the world alive, flawed, but moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, Dorian let himself close his eyes and rest. For tonight, at least, the road was behind him.